For my 28th birthday, my family threw me a surprise party. At least that's what they told me. When I walked into the private room at Harper's Grill that evening, about 40 people were already there. Friends. A few relatives. Some of my parents' longtime neighbors. Even two of my dad's coworkers stood near the bar. For a moment I thought it was actually sweet. There were balloons tied to the backs of chairs. A long table along the wall held a cake with white frosting and gold candles shaped like the number 28. Someone had even hung a banner above the window that said, "Happy Birthday, Emily." People smiled when I walked in. A few clapped lightly. My mom hugged me first. "Surprise," she said, squeezing my shoulders. My dad stood near the center of the room holding a glass of water. My younger sister, Claire, leaned against the back wall with her phone already in her hand. Everything looked normal. Almost. "I'm glad you're here, by the way. Stay with me until the end of this story, and if you want, tell me the city you're watching from. I'm always curious how far stories like this travel." At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about stories. I was thinking about cake. I was thinking about how strange it was that my parents had organized something like this without telling me. They weren't usually the surprise party type. But I didn't question it. Not right away. I said hello to a few people near the door. My college friend Mark waved from a table near the window. One of my cousins lifted his drink in a small toast. For a moment, everything felt warm. Normal. Then my dad cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in a room that size it carried easily. People stopped talking almost immediately. My dad had always had that kind of presence. He walked slowly toward the front of the room and tapped a spoon against the side of his glass. The light clink echoed once. Then again. The conversations faded. My first thought was that he was about to give a birthday toast. You know the kind. Something slightly embarrassing about when I was a kid. Maybe a joke about how old 28 sounded. That's what parents usually do at birthdays. Instead, my dad looked around the room very carefully. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten almost instantly. "Thank you all for coming tonight." His voice was calm, measured. "But we're not actually here to celebrate Emily's birthday." A few people chuckled lightly. They thought he was joking. I smiled too. For about 3 seconds. Then he continued. "We're here because we're worried about her." The room went quiet. Not dramatic quiet. Just the kind where people stopped chewing and glanced toward each other. My dad folded his hands in front of him. "Emily has been making some decisions lately that are damaging our family." My smile disappeared. Completely. Across the room, my sister Claire shifted her phone slightly. She was filming. At first I thought maybe she was just recording the party. Then I noticed something else. The camera wasn't pointed at the cake. It was pointed directly at me. My mom stepped forward next. She was holding a folded sheet of paper. "I know this may feel uncomfortable," she said softly, glancing toward the guests. "But sometimes honesty is the most loving thing a family can offer." My heart started beating faster. Because I realized something important. This wasn't a birthday speech. This wasn't a joke. And it definitely wasn't a surprise party. My dad gestured toward one of the empty chairs near the center table. "Emily," he said. His tone was gentle. Too gentle. "Why don't you sit down for a moment?" Several people turned their chairs slightly so they could see me better. 40 faces. Waiting. Watching. I walked slowly to the chair. My legs felt strangely light, like the floor had shifted under them. When I sat down, my sister moved closer to the side of the room. Her phone followed me. Still recording. My dad took a deep breath. "We're here tonight," he said, looking directly at me now, "because you've been acting selfishly." The word landed harder than I expected. "Selfish," he continued. "Ungrateful." Another pause. "And frankly, you're tearing this family apart." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. My mom unfolded the paper in her hands. "I've written down a few things," she said quietly. Her voice sounded calm. Prepared. Like she had practiced this. "Just examples," she added. "Examples? Of what?" I didn't ask. I didn't say anything at all. Because suddenly it became very clear what was happening. This wasn't a birthday party. It was an intervention. And everyone in that room had been invited to watch it happen. My mom began reading from the list. Emily stopped attending family dinners regularly about 2 years ago. She looked up briefly. You said you were busy with work. A few people nodded sympathetically. Then she looked back down. Last Thanksgiving, she declined to travel home even though we offered to pay for her ticket. Another pause. And when your cousin asked for help with a short-term loan, you refused. The list continued. Each example small. Each one framed as evidence. Across the room, I could hear someone quietly clearing their throat. My sister moved slightly closer again. Still filming. My dad folded his arms. We're not doing this to embarrass you, he said. Several people nodded again. We're doing this because we love you. I finally looked around the room. Really looked. Some faces showed concern. Others looked uncomfortable. A few seemed curious. Like they were watching something they hadn't expected, but didn't want to miss. 40 people. All listening to a list of everything I had supposedly done wrong since childhood. And strangely, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt quiet. Because while my parents had spent weeks preparing their intervention, they had forgotten to ask one important question. What if I had come prepared too? My mom held the paper with both hands. It wasn't just a few notes. It was a list. A long one. From where I sat, I could see the page was almost completely filled with writing. Bullet points. Underlines. A few phrases circled in pen like someone had edited it several times. She cleared her throat before continuing. Over the past few years, she said carefully, Emily has gradually distanced herself from the family. Her voice was calm. Measured. The way people speak when they believe they are being reasonable. She stopped coming to Sunday dinners, my mom continued. A woman near the back nodded sympathetically. She rarely answers calls. Another pause. And when we try to discuss concerns, she shuts down instead of communicating. A few heads in the room turned toward me. Not angry. Just curious. Like they were waiting for me to respond. But I didn't. I just sat there. Because the moment I had walked through that door earlier, something had become clear. This wasn't a conversation. This was a presentation. My father stepped forward again. Emily has always been independent, he said, glancing toward the guests. We used to admire that about her. Used to. But lately, he continued, that independence has turned into isolation. Someone near the window murmured softly. I'm sure she doesn't mean it that way. My father nodded politely. That's exactly why we're doing this, he said. Then he turned back toward me. You've been pushing everyone away. The sentence hung there. Simple. Certain. My mom looked down at her paper again. There's more. Of course there was. She read the next point. Last year when your grandmother was sick, you only visited twice. That one stung a little. Not because it was true, but because it was incomplete. My grandmother had asked me not to come more often. She didn't want visitors seeing her during the worst part of her illness. But that detail wasn't on the list. My mom continued reading. When we offered to help you move closer to home, you refused. Another small pause. And when your sister invited you to join the family business, you declined without even considering it. Claire shifted slightly against the wall, still filming. Her phone hadn't moved from my direction. The camera light was still on. I could see it clearly now. My dad folded his arms. You've built a life that excludes us, he said. The sentence sounded rehearsed. Like something that had been practiced earlier. And maybe it had been. Because everything about this evening felt organized. Planned. My mom lowered the page slightly. We're not saying you're a bad person, she added. We're saying you've made choices that hurt the people who love you. The room stayed quiet. A man at one of the tables cleared his throat softly. Another guest shifted his chair. 40 people. All sitting in a semicircle around a chair in the center of the room. And that chair was mine. My dad stepped closer. Emily, he said. His voice softened. This is a chance to fix things. Several people nodded again. Encouraging. Supportive. Almost hopeful. We just want you to admit there's a problem, he continued. My sister's phone moved slightly closer. Still recording. Somewhere near the back of the room someone whispered. This is probably good for her. Another voice responded quietly. Yeah. Sometimes people need tough love. I listened to all of it. Every word. Every explanation. Every quiet judgment. And I stayed completely still. Because the truth was, none of this surprised me. Not really. Over the past few years, there had been smaller moments that hinted something like this might happen. A comment here. A family meeting there. Little suggestions that I should come back home. That I should reconnect with the family's priorities. That I should stop living like I didn't need anyone. But this was something bigger. An intervention. On my birthday. In front of 40 witnesses. My mom folded the paper slowly. That's the list, she said. Then she looked directly at me. Do you have anything you'd like to say? The room held its breath. Even Claire lowered her phone slightly, as if expecting something dramatic. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I looked around the room again. Really looked. There were people here who had known me since childhood. Neighbors. Family friends. A few people from my parents' church. Most of them probably believed they were helping fix something broken. But they were missing one important detail. They had only heard one version of the story. My father leaned slightly toward me. You can start with an apology, he said quietly. That suggestion earned a few approving nods from the crowd. Apology. Admission. Resolution. That was the ending they expected. But the evening wasn't following the script they had written. Not anymore. Because while my parents had spent weeks preparing their list, they had overlooked something simple. I had been sitting there quietly the entire time. Listening. Waiting. And when my dad said one more sentence, "We're doing this because we love you," I finally spoke. Just 4 words. Calm. Even. That's interesting. The room froze. My sister's phone lifted again. My dad frowned slightly. What do you mean? I looked directly at him. Then I glanced at the phone still recording in Claire's hand. And I said something that none of them had prepared for. Because I've been recording too. For a few seconds no one spoke. The sentence hung in the air like someone had turned off the music in the middle of a party. I've been recording too. My dad blinked once like he wasn't sure he had heard me correctly. My sister's phone was still pointed at me. The camera light reflected in her glasses. What do you mean? My dad asked. His voice sounded calmer than his face looked. I leaned back slightly in the chair. Exactly what I said. The room shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the subtle movement of 40 people realizing the situation might not be as simple as they thought 5 minutes ago. My mom frowned slightly. You recorded this conversation? No, I said. And then I paused. I recorded the planning meeting. That sentence landed much harder. My sister's arm lowered halfway. What planning meeting? She asked quickly. My dad didn't look at her. He was looking at me. Carefully now. The way someone watches a chessboard when they realize the other player might not be losing after all. You're misunderstanding something, he said. Maybe he hoped that if he said it early enough, the story would stay under control. But the room had already changed. People were listening differently now. Not to fix me. To understand what was happening. I reached slowly into my bag and pulled out my phone. The movement was small, but it immediately captured everyone's attention. My sister raised her phone again. Still recording. Of course she was. My dad stepped forward slightly. Emily, he said quietly, let's not make this into something unnecessary. Unnecessary. That word was interesting. Because 5 minutes earlier, the intervention itself had apparently been very necessary. But I didn't argue. I simply unlocked my phone and placed it face up on the table beside the cake. The cake that still said Happy Birthday Emily in gold frosting. The candles hadn't even been lit. I tapped the screen once. Then I looked back up at the room. 2 weeks ago, I said. I stopped by Mom and Dad's house. My mom's expression changed immediately. Not anger. Recognition. You weren't supposed to, she started. But she stopped herself halfway through the sentence. That was enough. The room heard it. I continued calmly. You didn't hear me come in. That part had been accidental. I had walked in through the side door because my dad's car was already in the driveway. The kitchen had been empty. But voices were coming from the dining room. My mom. My dad. My sister. And 2 other people. my Aunt Karen, and my cousin David. They had been sitting around the table, talking, planning. At the time I hadn't even known what they were discussing. Not until I heard my name. I looked around the room again. 40 people. Most of them had probably assumed tonight's intervention was spontaneous. Concerned parents. A worried family. An attempt to help someone who had lost their way. But the truth had started much earlier than tonight. And I had proof. I pressed play. At first, the room only heard the soft sound of chairs moving. The recording picked up the clink of dishes. Someone pouring coffee. Then my dad's voice. Clear. Unmistakable. She's not going to listen if we talk to her privately. The room froze. My mom's voice came next. That's why we need witnesses. Several heads turned slowly toward my parents. The recording continued. My sister's voice this time. If we do it at her birthday dinner, she can't leave. Someone near the back of the room whispered something under their breath. I let the recording keep playing. My dad again. We need everyone there. A pause. Friends. Family. People she respects. My Aunt Karen spoke next. What's the goal here exactly? My dad answered without hesitation. To make her realize she can't keep living like she doesn't need us. A small ripple moved through the room. Not loud. Just the sound of people adjusting their understanding. But the recording wasn't finished yet. My sister spoke again. And this time her voice sounded excited. I'm telling you, if we film it right, it'll blow up online. My phone speaker filled the room with the sound of her laugh. A quiet, confident laugh. I can post clips, she continued. Like a real intervention video. The room went completely silent. Even Claire's phone lowered. Slowly. Because now she wasn't filming a family intervention anymore. She was standing inside the recording she had planned. My dad's voice returned. Good, he said. Public pressure might finally break her. Break her. Those were the exact words. I stopped the recording. The silence afterward felt heavier than anything that had happened all evening. 40 people. No one speaking. No one smiling. The birthday banner still hanging over the window. And suddenly the intervention looked very different. My dad stared at the phone on the table. Then at me. His voice was quieter now. Emily. But he didn't finish the sentence. Because for the first time that night, the room wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking at him. No one spoke after the recording. Stop. Not my dad. Not my mom. Not my sister. The phone was still sitting on the table beside the cake. Its screen glowing faintly. 40 people had just heard the same thing. And the room felt different now. Not tense in the way it had felt earlier. Earlier, the tension had been aimed at me. Concerned looks. Sympathetic nods. People waiting for me to admit something was wrong with my life. But now the tension had shifted. The silence in the room was heavier. Because the story they thought they were watching had just changed. My dad finally moved. He took one slow step toward the table. Emily, he said. His voice sounded careful now. Too careful. You misunderstood what that conversation was about. Several people in the room turned toward him. Because that was the obvious next explanation. Misunderstanding. Maybe the recording was incomplete. Maybe there was context missing. Maybe it sounded worse than it really was. That's what everyone hoped. I didn't interrupt him. I simply waited. My dad glanced around the room, measuring the reactions. We were discussing how to help you, he said. The sentence sounded reasonable. Almost convincing. If you listen to part of a conversation out of context. I tapped the phone screen again. The recording resumed. My Aunt Karen's voice filled the room. What if she walks out? My dad answered immediately. She won't. A pause. Not with 40 people watching. I stopped the recording again. The room went quiet. The explanation my father had just started to build collapsed almost instantly. Across the room someone shifted in their chair. One of my dad's coworkers crossed his arms slowly. My mom stepped forward this time. Her expression looked strained. Emily, she said softly. You didn't need to bring this here. Bring it here. The phrase made me pause for a second. Because that was the interesting part. I hadn't brought the situation here. They had. They had planned it. Invited people. Written a script. Prepared a list. I looked at her. You mean my birthday dinner? I asked. She didn't answer. Claire finally lowered her phone. For the first time that evening, the camera wasn't pointed at me anymore. She looked at my dad instead. "Dad," she said quietly. But he didn't respond. He was still staring at the phone on the table, like it had suddenly become something dangerous. Someone near the back of the room spoke. It was Mark, my college friend. He had been sitting quietly near the window the entire time. "You planned this?" he asked. The question wasn't angry, just confused. My dad straightened slightly. "We organized an intervention," he said. "That's not the same thing as planning to humiliate someone." Another voice joined in. One of the neighbors who had known our family for years. "But you said you needed witnesses." No one rushed to defend my parents. Not immediately. And that hesitation changed the atmosphere more than anything else. Because earlier, everyone in the room had assumed they were here for a good reason. Concern, support, love. But now they were reconsidering. I leaned back in the chair again. Still calm. Still quiet. My mom looked at me carefully. "You could have talked to us privately," she said. The irony of that sentence hung in the air for a moment. My dad rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This is getting out of hand," he said. Then he turned to the room. "I'm sorry everyone had to hear that recording." Several people glanced at each other, not sure what to do. Apologizing for the recording was an interesting choice. It suggested the real problem was that people had heard the truth. I stood up slowly. The chair legs scraped lightly against the floor. Immediately, 40 pairs of eyes followed the movement. I wasn't angry. I wasn't yelling. But I was done sitting in the center of the room like a defendant in a trial. "I didn't come here expecting any of this," I said. My voice sounded steady. Because it was. I thought it was my birthday dinner. No one argued with that. Because the banner still hanging over the window made that part obvious. "Happy birthday, Emily." The cake still hadn't been cut. The candles still hadn't been lit. But the celebration had clearly ended. My dad looked at me again. "What exactly do you want, Emily?" The question sounded tired. Not aggressive. Just frustrated. I thought about that for a moment. Because it was actually a good question. What did I want? Not revenge. Not embarrassment. And definitely not a public argument. I glanced around the room one more time. 40 people. Some uncomfortable. Some curious. Some already realizing they had been invited into something they didn't fully understand. Then I looked back. And my dad. "You asked everyone here to help fix me," I said. He didn't deny it. "That's what interventions are for." I nodded slightly. "Okay." A small pause. Then I picked up my phone from the table. "There's just one problem with that plan." My dad frowned. "What problem?" I slipped the phone back into my bag. Then I said the sentence that finally shifted the entire night. "You invited 40 people to hear your version of the story." The room stayed very quiet. And I only needed one recording. I looked around the room again. For them to hear mine. For a moment after I said that, the room didn't move. Not a single chair scraped. Not a single glass lifted. 40 people were sitting in a birthday party that had turned into something else entirely. Earlier that evening, the attention had been focused on me. My decisions. My independence. My supposed selfishness. But now the center of the room had shifted. My dad stood near the head of the table. My mom beside him. My sister still holding her phone though she wasn't filming anymore. And the questions had started. Not loud ones. Just quiet ones. The kind that slowly changed the direction of a room. Mark spoke first. He leaned forward slightly in his chair near the window. "So, you invited everyone here to confront Emily?" My dad straightened his shoulders. "We invited people who care about her." "That's not what I asked," Mark replied calmly. My dad hesitated. That was the first hesitation I had seen from him all evening. "We wanted support," he said. Another pause. "A support system." Several people shifted uncomfortably. Because support systems don't usually start with speeches and lists. And they definitely don't usually involve 40 witnesses. My Aunt Karen cleared her throat. "Well, interventions do sometimes involve family and friends." Her voice sounded uncertain now. Earlier she had sounded confident. Prepared. But the recording had changed something. Because everyone in the room now knew that the intervention hadn't just been organized. It had been staged. Across the table, one of my dad's co-workers finally spoke. He was an older man named Richard. Quiet most of the evening. "I'm a little confused," he said. He looked at my dad. "You said Emily was isolating herself." "That's correct," my dad replied quickly. "But the recording suggested something else." Richard folded his hands together. It sounded like the goal was to pressure her. No one answered immediately, because that was exactly what the recording had revealed. Pressure. Public pressure. My mom stepped forward again. "Richard, you don't understand the whole situation." "I'm sure I don't," he said politely. "That's why I'm asking." Several people nodded slightly. The room had started thinking again. Not reacting. Thinking. My sister finally spoke. "Everyone's blowing this out of proportion." Her voice sounded sharper than before. "We were trying to help her." She looked at me. "You've been pulling away from the family for years." I didn't argue, because that part was true. But the reason for it wasn't the story they had been telling tonight. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Emily," he said quietly, "is any of what they said actually true?" The question wasn't hostile, just direct. And for the first time that evening, someone had asked me instead of speaking for me. I nodded once. "Some of it." My mom looked relieved. "You see," she said quickly, "she knows there's a problem." But I continued. "Yes, I stopped coming to Sunday dinners." A few people listened carefully now. "Yes, I moved farther away." Another pause. "And yes, I declined to join the family business." My sister rolled her eyes. "Exactly. But I wasn't finished. Because I was asked to." The sentence landed quietly, but it changed the room again. My dad frowned. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him. 3 years ago," I said, "you told me I needed to figure out my life without relying on the family." My dad blinked. "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you said." My mom shook her head. "That conversation was about responsibility." I nodded. "I know." Another small pause. And I listened. The room had gone very quiet again, because the story had started to split into two versions. The version my parents had presented tonight, and the version that had actually happened. Mark looked at my dad again. "So, you told her to be independent." My dad shifted slightly. "And now you're upset that she is?" No one answered, because the logic of that question was difficult to avoid. My sister tried to interrupt. "That's not the point." But Richard raised a hand gently. "Actually," he said, "it might be." The room watched him now. He turned toward my dad. "Robert, you asked 40 people to come here tonight because you believe your daughter is damaging the family." My dad nodded slowly. "Yes." Richard glanced toward me. "And according to the recording, you planned this weeks in advance." My dad didn't respond. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. "I just want to understand something." He paused, then asked the question that quietly changed everything. "Did you ever ask her why she stepped away in the first place?" The room waited. My mom opened her mouth, but she stopped before answering, because suddenly the room had realized something important. All evening people had been talking about me, about my choices, about my behavior, but no one had actually asked me the simplest question of all. Why? I looked around the room again. 40 people. Most of them realizing the same thing at the same time. And for the first time that evening, the intervention didn't look like a solution anymore. It looked like a misunderstanding, one that had been carefully planned, but never actually investigated. Richard's question stayed in the room. It didn't sound dramatic. It didn't sound angry. But it was the first honest question anyone had asked all evening. "Did you ever ask her why she stepped away in the first place?" For a few seconds no one answered. My dad looked at the table. My mom folded the piece of paper with the list of complaints. My sister shifted her weight against the wall, her phone now hanging loosely in her hand. Earlier, that phone had been aimed at me like a spotlight. Now the spotlight had moved. I stayed standing near the chair where they had asked me to sit earlier. 40 people were still watching. But the energy in the room had changed. Before, the room had felt like a courtroom. Now it felt more like a puzzle. Pieces of the story were starting to move. My dad cleared his throat. "That's not really the issue," he said. His voice sounded controlled again. But it wasn't as confident as it had been 20 minutes earlier. "The issue is that Emily has distanced herself from the family." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "But people usually have reasons for that." My mom stepped in quickly. "She's always been stubborn." The sentence came out fast. Too fast. "She pushes people away when things get difficult." My sister nodded immediately. "Exactly." Several people looked at them. Then they looked at me, waiting. Because for the first time that evening the conversation had actually reached me. Mark leaned forward slightly. "So why did you?" he asked. The room stayed quiet. Even the servers who had been passing near the door had stopped moving. I took a breath. Not a dramatic one. Just a normal breath. Because the truth was simple. I stepped away because things changed. My dad frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the family business changed." That caught a few people's attention. My parents owned a small financial consulting firm. It had been part of our family for years. My sister worked there. My cousin worked there. Even my Aunt Karen handled some of the administrative work. My mom spoke carefully. "The business is doing very well." "I know," I said. That part was true. But that wasn't the point. 3 years earlier my dad had called me into his office. Not the office at the firm. His home office. The one with the big oak desk and the framed photos of our family vacations. He had closed the door before speaking. "You need to start taking responsibility for your life," he had said. I remembered the sentence clearly, because it had surprised me at the time. I was already working full-time, paying my own rent, building a career in marketing that had nothing to do with the family company. "I'm not going to support you forever," he had continued. The statement had confused me. I hadn't asked for support, but the message had been clear. If I wanted independence, I needed to take it completely. So I did. I declined the offer to join the company. I stopped relying on family connections for work. I built a career that didn't depend on the business. At the time I thought that was exactly what he wanted. Back in the restaurant my dad shook his head. "That's not the way I meant it. It's the way it sounded." My mom stepped forward again. "You didn't need to disappear." "I didn't disappear," I said calmly. "I moved." Several people nodded slightly. Moving for work was normal. Common. My sister crossed her arms. "You stopped coming around." "Yes," I said. "Because every time I did, the conversation turned into this." I gestured lightly toward the room. The list. The accusations. The intervention. My mom looked frustrated. "That's not fair." "It's accurate." Silence again. Not angry silence. Just the kind that happens when people start realizing two different versions of a story have been living in the same room. Richard spoke again. "Let me see if I understand this." Everyone turned toward him. "Robert told Emily to become independent." My dad didn't argue. Richard continued. "She did exactly that." Another pause. "And tonight you invited 40 people to confront her for doing it." The logic landed quietly. But it landed. My dad rubbed his forehead. "This isn't that simple." Mark tilted his head slightly. "It kind of is." My sister stepped forward again. "No, it's not." Her voice had lost the playful energy it had earlier. "This intervention wasn't about the business." She pointed toward me. "It's about the way she treats the family." That sentence shifted the room again. Because now the conversation had moved away from the past. Toward something else. Something personal. My dad nodded slowly. "That's the real issue." He looked at me directly. "You've changed." The room waited. Because that statement sounded like the beginning of something important. I nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "I did." My dad's expression tightened. "And you don't see why that concerns us?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "No," I said. Another pause. Because the truth was, the reason I had changed wasn't something they had included on their list. And they were about to hear it. For the first time. The room stayed quiet after I said that. "No," I said again. "I don't see why it concerns you." 40 people were watching now. Not with judgment like earlier. with curiosity, because something had shifted during the last few minutes. The room had slowly realized that the story wasn't as simple as my parents had presented it. My dad folded his arms. "You've changed," he repeated. His voice sounded firm again. "But you won't explain why." I nodded slightly. "You're right." My sister shook her head. "Of course she won't," she said. "That's what she always does." Several people glanced toward her. Earlier that comment might have sounded convincing. Now it sounded defensive. I rested my hands lightly on the back of the chair in front of me. "I didn't explain it before," I said. "That part is true." My mom stepped forward. "Because you didn't want to." "No," I replied. "Because you didn't want to hear it." The room went quiet again. My dad frowned. "That's not fair." "It is." He opened his mouth to argue, but I continued before he could. 3 years ago," I said. "When you told me I needed to figure out my life without depending on the family, I believed you." My dad shook his head. "You're still twisting that conversation." "I'm repeating it." Mark leaned forward slightly again. "What happened after that?" I looked at him. 6 months later," I said. "I got a call from the bank." My mom's expression changed immediately. My dad didn't move. "Which bank?" someone asked quietly. "The one that handles the family company accounts." That detail caught the attention of a few people in the room, because the business wasn't small. It had grown steadily over the years. Consulting contracts, private clients, investments. My dad said nothing, so I continued. "The bank called because my name was still attached to one of the company credit lines." Several heads turned toward my father. My sister looked confused. "What credit line?" My dad finally spoke. "That was paperwork from years ago." "Yes," I said. "It was." Another pause. "But the account had just gone over the credit limit." That sentence landed quietly, but people understood what it meant. Financial accounts don't exceed limits on their own. Someone had used it. Richard spoke first. "You're saying Emily was listed as responsible for that account?" I nodded. "Jointly responsible." My sister frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It did when I was 21. Back then, my parents had told me the same thing they told many young adults. It was just a formality, a way to help me build credit, a way to teach responsibility. I had trusted them. I signed the paperwork, and then I forgot about it, until the bank called." "How much?" Richard asked quietly. My dad shifted slightly, but I answered before he could. $78,000. The number settled over the room. My mom inhaled sharply. "That wasn't." She stopped herself, because she realized something. The room was listening now. Carefully. My dad spoke slowly. "That account was for business expenses." "Yes," I said. "And my name was still attached to it." My sister's voice rose slightly. "Why didn't you tell us about this?" I looked at her. "I did." Her face went blank. "I called Dad that afternoon." Everyone turned toward him. My dad rubbed his forehead again. "That situation was handled." I nodded. "It was." Another pause. "I paid it." The room froze. Mark blinked. "You what?" "I paid it." The words came out calmly. Because the decision had been made years ago. The consequences had already happened. The story just hadn't been shared until now. My mom looked stunned. "You never said that." I tried. Silence again. My dad stared at the table. "That was a misunderstanding with the account." "No," I said. "It wasn't." Another pause. "It was a business decision." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Emily, are you saying the family company used a credit line attached to your name?" "Yes." "And when the account went over the limit, I became responsible." The room stayed very still, because the intervention had just shifted into something much bigger. Earlier tonight, my parents had invited 40 people to discuss my behavior, my independence, my distance from the family. But now those 40 people were hearing a completely different story, one that hadn't been written on my mom's list. My dad spoke again. "You're leaving out context." Then add it. The sentence was simple, but it stopped him. Because the truth was, the context didn't make the story better. I looked around the room one more time. friends, neighbors, coworkers, all realizing the same thing. The person they had been invited to fix might not have been the problem. I picked up my phone again, not to play another recording, just to check the time. The birthday candles on the cake still hadn't been lit, and the night was far from over, because the next part of the story was the part my parents had hoped no one would ever hear. For several seconds after I said that I paid the $78,000, no one spoke. Not my dad. Not my mom. Not even my sister. The room had gone very still. Earlier that evening, the intervention had been built on a simple idea. That I was irresponsible, selfish, disconnected from the family. But the number I had just said didn't fit that story very well. $78,000. That's not the kind of mistake someone irresponsible quietly cleans up. Mark spoke first. You paid the entire thing yourself? Yes. His eyebrows lifted slightly. When? 3 years ago. My mom looked confused. But you were just starting your job then. That's right. The job I had taken after declining the position at the family firm. The job my parents had quietly referred to as a phase. My sister crossed her arms. That still doesn't make sense. She pointed toward me. If that account was for the business, why would you be responsible for it? Because my name was on the credit line. That doesn't mean you had to pay it. Yes, I said calmly. It did. Because the bank had been very clear. When multiple names are attached to a credit account, responsibility doesn't get divided by intention. It gets divided by signatures. And my signature had been there. Richard leaned forward slightly. Did the company reimburse you? My dad answered before I could. That situation was handled internally. I looked at him. It wasn't. The room stayed quiet. My dad sighed. We discussed repayment. Yes, I said. We did. Another pause. But the business was having a slow quarter. My mom shook her head. That's not fair. It's accurate. The memory of that conversation was still clear. My dad sitting at his desk. My mom standing near the door. Both of them explaining that the company couldn't absorb the debt immediately, but it would be taken care of eventually. Eventually. That word had been used a lot in that conversation. Eventually the business would recover. Eventually the account would balance. Eventually things would work out. But banks don't operate on eventually. Payment deadlines are much more specific. Mark rubbed his chin. So Emily paid it? Yes. Richard asked the next obvious question. Did the company ever pay you back? No, the answer landed quietly. But it echoed through the room. Because suddenly the timeline made more sense. 3 years ago. $78,000. A daughter stepping away from the family business. My sister stared at me. You never told me any of this. I looked at her. You never asked. She didn't respond. My dad spoke again. You're making it sound like we abandoned you. I'm describing what happened. That debt was part of the company. Yes. And the company supported you your entire life. My dad's voice had grown sharper now. A few people shifted in their seats. But I didn't raise my voice. Because this part of the story didn't require emotion. Just clarity. I didn't ask the company to support me, I said. The room listened carefully now. I asked the company to remove my name from an account I didn't control. Richard nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. My dad looked frustrated. It was more complicated than that. I tilted my head slightly. How? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because the explanation was difficult to simplify in front of 40 people. Especially people who understood business. Mark spoke quietly. If Emily was responsible for the credit line, the bank would have pursued her legally. Yes, I said. That was the next step. My mom's eyes widened. They threatened legal action? They sent a notice. Another pause. And I paid the balance before that happened. The room went quiet again. Earlier tonight, my parents had described me as selfish, ungrateful, someone who had abandoned the family. But now the room was hearing something else. A daughter who had quietly absorbed a financial problem to protect the family business. My sister looked at my dad. Did you know she paid the full amount? My dad hesitated. Yes. Then why didn't you tell anyone? No answer came immediately, because the truth was uncomfortable. The story my parents had prepared for tonight didn't include that detail. It didn't include the credit line. It didn't include the debt. It definitely didn't include the part where I had taken care of it. I picked up my glass of water from the table and took a small sip. The cake was still untouched. The candles still unlit. 40 people still sitting in a room that had started as a birthday party. And now 6 or 7 of them were beginning to look at my parents differently. Richard leaned back slightly. I think I understand why Emily stepped away. No one argued with him. My dad looked at the floor. My mom folded her arms. My sister stared at the phone still resting in her hand. Earlier that evening, she had said something during the recording. Something excited. Something confident. If we film it right, it'll blow up online. But now the story unfolding in front of her wasn't the one she expected. I set my glass down on the table. I didn't leave the family, I said quietly. Everyone listened. I just stopped fixing problems no one wanted to talk about. And for the first time that night, several people in the room nodded. After I said that, the room didn't react immediately. But you could see it happening. People were thinking. Earlier that night, they had arrived expecting to help fix a problem. A daughter who had become distant. A family that needed support. An intervention. That was the story my parents had told them. But the version unfolding now was different. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair. So let me get this straight, he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my dad. Emily paid off a $78,000 credit line connected to the family business. My dad didn't answer. Mark continued. And after that, she stepped away. Richard nodded slightly. That actually sounds pretty reasonable. My mom shook her head. That's not the full story. Her voice had that same careful tone again. The one she used earlier when she read the list. There were other issues. My sister immediately agreed. Yes, she said. She stopped coming around completely. I looked at her. Not completely. She frowned. You missed Christmas 2 years ago. Yes, I said. I did. My mom raised her hand slightly. Exactly. But the room was paying closer attention now. Mark asked the obvious question. Why? The word hung in the air. Because earlier tonight, that question had never been asked. Not once. My mom glanced at my dad. He looked irritated. Emily knows why, he said. I nodded. I do. Richard leaned forward again. Would you mind explaining it? The room waited. Not impatiently. Just quietly. Because now people were trying to understand the entire picture. Not just the version that had been written on my mom's paper. I took a breath. 2 weeks before Christmas that year, I said, I got another call. My sister rolled her eyes. Another bank story? No, I looked directly at her. This one was from a client. That caught a few people's attention. Because my parents' firm didn't just work with numbers. It worked with people. Private clients. Small businesses. Investors. The kind of clients who trusted them with major financial decisions. The room stayed quiet. The client asked me a question. I continued. A simple one. My dad stiffened slightly. I noticed it immediately. Richard noticed too. What was the question? He asked. I didn't look away from my father when I answered. He asked why the company's investment recommendation had suddenly changed. No one spoke. But the tension in the room had returned. Not the same kind as earlier. This tension was sharper. Because now the conversation had moved away from family disagreements toward business decisions. My mom stepped forward quickly. That has nothing to do with tonight. It has everything to do with tonight. My sister frowned. What are you talking about? I looked at her. The client told me something strange. Several people leaned forward slightly. He said the recommendation had changed after he declined to invest in a different project. Richard's eyebrows lifted. What kind of project? The new property development Dad had been promoting. My dad's voice came quickly. That's a misrepresentation. But I continued calmly. The client thought it was just a coincidence. Another pause. But he asked if I knew anything about it. Mark looked at my dad again. Did you? No, my dad said sharply. But I was still speaking. At the time, I said, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. And that part was true. Because I trusted my parents. I trusted the company. I trusted the idea that everything being done was professional, ethical, normal. So I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I reviewed the investment files. My sister laughed slightly. You went through company records? Yes. My mom shook her head. You had no right to do that. I was still listed as a partner on the documents. That detail changed the room again. Because technically, I had every right. Richard spoke quietly. And what did you find? My dad answered before I could. Nothing. But I looked at Richard instead. I found emails. The word landed heavily. Emails leave trails. They don't disappear easily. Mark's voice was calm now. What kind of emails? The kind that explain why the recommendation changed. My sister stared at me. You're lying. I shook my head. No, the room was completely silent again. Because now people weren't just questioning the intervention. They were questioning the foundation underneath it. My dad finally stepped forward. That conversation is private business. But Mark shook his head slightly. You invited 40 people into a private family issue. He glanced around the room. Now it sounds like there might have been a different reason Emily walked away. My dad looked furious now. That's not what happened. I looked at him. It is. Another pause. Because there was one detail I hadn't shared yet. One detail that explained everything. Not just why I left the company, but why I stopped coming to family dinners. Why I declined invitations. Why I refused to rejoin the business. And why tonight's intervention had been built on a story that ignored the truth. I picked up my phone again. Not to play the earlier recording. This was something else. Something newer. Something I had kept for exactly this moment. Because earlier that night, my parents had invited 40 people to watch me take responsibility. But the next thing they were about to hear was the reason I refused to. When I picked up my phone again, the room immediately went quiet. Not because people expected another recording, but because by now everyone understood something important. Every time I had touched that phone tonight, the story had shifted. 40 people were watching. My dad stood near the head of the table, his jaw tight. My mom had stopped holding the list she had prepared earlier. The paper was now folded in her hands, almost forgotten. And my sister was no longer filming. Her phone hung loosely at her side. Emily, my dad said carefully, whatever you think you found. I didn't think, I replied. I checked. That stopped him. Richard leaned forward slightly again. Emily said she found emails. The word hung in the air. Emails. Not accusations. Not guesses. Emails. My mom spoke quickly. You had no right to go through company communication. I was still listed on the documents, I said. That made it my liability too. No one argued with that. Because business documents don't care about family feelings. They care about signatures. Mark spoke quietly. What kind of emails? I unlocked my phone slowly. Not dramatically. Just enough for the room to notice. 2 weeks before Christmas, I said. A client asked why the investment recommendation changed. I paused. At the time, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. My dad shook his head. That's exactly what it was. But I continued. So I checked the internal correspondence attached to the file. Richard nodded. That's standard practice. My mom exhaled sharply. Emily. But I was already speaking. The recommendation changed 3 days after the client declined to invest in Dad's property development project. No one moved. Because now people were connecting the pieces. My dad's voice came out harder this time. That's a serious accusation. It's a timeline. Another pause. Then I tapped my phone. I saved one email. I didn't press play on a recording. I didn't hand the phone around. I simply read it. Subject line. Client strategy adjustment. The room stayed very quiet. Sent from Dad's account. My father didn't interrupt. Because he knew exactly which email I meant. I read the line slowly. If he's not willing to support the development project, we should reconsider his position in the growth portfolio. The sentence settled over the room. My mom's face had gone pale. My sister stared at my dad. That doesn't mean. It means the investment recommendation changed for a different reason, Richard said quietly. Mark nodded. That's not a market decision. My dad stepped forward. You're twisting a single sentence into something unethical. I looked at him. I checked the follow-up email too. Another pause. This one felt heavier, because by now everyone understood what follow-up emails usually contain. Context, confirmation, proof. I continued reading. If he won't cooperate, there's no reason to prioritize his returns. No one spoke. The restaurant felt completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving near the doorway. 40 people sitting around a birthday cake that had never been cut, listening to a story none of them expected to hear. My dad's voice was lower now. That email was taken out of context. Richard shook his head slowly. I've worked in finance for 30 years. He looked at my dad. That context sounds very clear. My sister stared at him. You can't judge a business conversation from 2 sentences. But Mark answered calmly. You can when those sentences explain a client's sudden investment loss. The room absorbed that quietly, because now everyone understood the missing piece. The reason I had reviewed the files, the reason I had walked away from the company, and the reason I had refused to come back. I lowered my phone. I didn't confront anyone, I said. The room listened carefully. I didn't accuse anyone. That was true. 3 years ago I had simply stepped away. From the business. From the conversations. From the family dinners where the company stories were always told with pride. My mom's voice was shaky now. You're saying you left because of that? Yes. My dad shook his head. You're exaggerating. No, I said. I'm drawing a line. Another quiet pause. Because that line mattered. Mark spoke again. So let me understand this. Everyone looked at him. Emily paid off a $78,000 credit line connected to the company. He glanced toward my father. Then she discovered internal emails suggesting a client recommendation was changed for personal leverage. No one corrected him. And after that, he said slowly, she left. He leaned back in his chair. That doesn't sound like someone abandoning their family. Richard nodded. It sounds like someone protecting themselves. My dad's voice came out sharp. That's not what happened. But the room wasn't looking at me anymore. And they weren't looking at the cake. Or the banner. Or the list my mom had prepared. They were looking at him. Because the intervention had started with 40 people believing I needed to explain myself. But now the story had turned. And the person being asked to explain something was no longer me. No one spoke right away after Mark said that. The sentence stayed in the room. That doesn't sound like someone abandoning their family. Earlier that night, people had arrived expecting something simple. A daughter who needed guidance. Parents who were worried. Friends gathering to help fix a problem. But now the situation looked very different. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying my father carefully. You invited 40 people here tonight, he said calmly. My dad didn't respond. Richard continued. You told us Emily was hurting the family. Another pause. But the information we just heard changes that picture. My dad finally spoke. You're hearing one side of the story. His voice sounded controlled again, but the edge in it was sharper now. My mom stepped forward quickly. Yes, she said. Exactly. She looked around the room, trying to reclaim the ground she had lost earlier. You're all forgetting something. Several people turned toward her. Emily didn't talk to us about any of this. She pointed toward me. She just disappeared. I nodded slightly. That's true. My sister stepped forward. You could have come to us. I did. Her expression hardened. When? 3 years ago. The room stayed quiet again. My dad frowned. That's not how I remember it. I know. I looked at him. Because that conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Mark tilted his head slightly. What happened in those 4 minutes? I thought about it. The memory was still clear. I showed Dad the email. The one I had read earlier. The one about the client recommendation. I asked him to explain it. My dad's face tightened. That was an internal discussion. Yes. But the decision affected a client. Richard nodded slowly. That matters. My dad's voice grew firmer. Emily misunderstood the situation. I didn't argue. I just continued. When I showed him the email, he told me something. The room leaned in again. Because now they were hearing the moment everything changed. My dad stared at the floor. But I said it anyway. He told me the business required difficult decisions. A small pause. And that if I couldn't understand that, I wasn't ready to be part of the company. Mark raised his eyebrows slightly. So he told you to leave. My dad shook his head quickly. That's not what I said. It's what I heard. Silence again. Because sometimes those two things are exactly the same. My mom stepped in. You could have come to me. I looked at her. You told me the same thing. Her eyes widened slightly. I did not. Yes, I said calmly. You said families succeed when everyone protects the business. The room absorbed that slowly. Richard spoke again. So Emily left the company. Yes. And she paid off a credit line connected to the company. Yes. And she walked away quietly. I nodded. Yes. Richard looked around the room. That sounds like someone trying to avoid making the situation worse. No one argued with him. My sister crossed her arms again. You're all acting like she's some kind of hero. No one answered her. Because that wasn't what anyone was saying. Mark leaned forward slightly. No, he said. We're just realizing something. My sister frowned. What? That tonight's intervention might have been based on the wrong story. The sentence landed gently, but it carried weight, because the story had clearly changed. My dad stepped forward. This conversation has gone far enough. He looked at the room. I appreciate everyone being here tonight. That sounded like an attempt to end the evening, to move past the uncomfortable part. But Richard shook his head slightly. I'm not sure it has. My dad looked irritated. What do you mean? Richard gestured toward the cake. You invited us here to watch an intervention. He paused. But what we've actually watched, another small pause, is a misunderstanding unfold. The room stayed quiet, because everyone knew that wasn't entirely true. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a story. A story my parents had built about why I left. A story they had told themselves, and then told everyone else. But stories change when new information appears. Mark looked toward me again. Emily, he said. Yes. Why did you come tonight? The question surprised a few people. But it was a fair one. I looked around the room. At the banner. At the untouched cake. At the chairs filled with people who had come expecting to fix someone. I came because it was my birthday, I said. A few people smiled faintly. Then I continued. And because I knew this conversation would eventually happen. My dad looked at me sharply. You expected this? I nodded. Yes. My sister stared at me. How? I glanced briefly at her phone. The same phone she had been using earlier. The one she had been excited to film with. The one she had mentioned in that planning conversation. I heard the recording 2 weeks ago, I said. The room went quiet again. My dad frowned. What recording? I looked around the room one last time. Moment the recording started playing. That story had broken. And now everyone in the room understood why. Richard spoke quietly. So you came here knowing what they planned? Yes. And you let it happen? Yes. He nodded slowly. That takes patience. I shrugged a little. It takes evidence. A few people smiled faintly at that. My mom still looked shaken. You could have warned us, she said. I met her eyes. You were planning to humiliate me in front of 40 people. Another pause. I assumed you were comfortable with public conversations. She didn't answer. My dad rubbed his forehead again. The confident man who had started the intervention earlier in the evening was gone now. In his place was someone realizing the situation had slipped beyond his control. This was supposed to help you, he said quietly. I nodded. I know. Then I added something he didn't expect. And in a strange way, it did. That confused him. How? I glanced around the room again. Because by now the entire night had changed shape. Mark had stopped looking at me like someone who needed help. Richard was studying my father instead. 2 of my dad's co-workers were whispering to each other. And my sister's phone was no longer recording anything. The intervention had reversed itself. I pointed gently toward the cake. Because tonight everyone finally heard the whole story. No one argued with that. The room had heard about the credit line, the debt, the emails, the conversation 3 years ago, the reason I walked away. All the things that never appeared on my mom's list. My sister spoke again. So what now? Her voice sounded smaller than earlier. The excitement from the recording about posting the video online had disappeared completely. What happens now? I thought about that for a moment, because the answer was simpler than anyone expected. Nothing, I said. The room waited. I'm not asking for apologies. I looked at my dad. I'm not asking anyone to pick sides. Another pause. I just wanted the truth in the room. Richard nodded slowly. That seems fair. Mark leaned back in his chair. You definitely accomplished that. A few people chuckled quietly, not because anything was funny, but because the tension had finally cracked. My dad looked around the room. He could see it too. The intervention was over. Not the way he planned, but over. He sighed. I think everyone should probably get some dessert. The sentence sounded awkward, almost hopeful, like maybe the evening could still return to something normal. But no one moved toward the cake, because people were already standing up. Quietly, one couple near the back picked up their coats. Richard stood as well. He walked past me and paused briefly. I'm glad you said something, he said. Thank you. Mark came over next. You okay? Yes. He smiled slightly. Happy birthday. That made me laugh a little, because somewhere along the way everyone had forgotten that part. My birthday. The reason I walked into the room in the first place. Within 10 minutes, the room had begun to empty. Not dramatically, just naturally. People leaving conversations unfinished. People rethinking things they had assumed earlier in the night. My dad's coworkers left together. Richard shook my father's hand before going. But the look he gave him was different now. Not hostile, just thoughtful. Mark left soon after. Then a few relatives. Then 2 neighbors. One by one. Until the room that had held 40 witnesses was nearly quiet again. My sister sat down at one of the tables, her phone still resting in front of her. This isn't how I thought tonight would go, she muttered. No, I said. It probably isn't. My mom sat slowly in one of the empty chairs. The list she had written earlier was still folded in her hand, but she wasn't reading from it anymore. My dad stood near the cake, the candles still untouched. For a long moment no one spoke. Then I picked up the cake knife and handed it to him. Go ahead, I said. He looked at me. Why? Because it's still my birthday. Another pause. Then he nodded once. And for the first time that evening someone lit the candles. Not for an intervention. Not for a confrontation. Just for a birthday. I made a wish. Not for the family to go back to the way it was. Some things don't work that way. But for something simpler. For honesty. Because earlier that night my parents had invited 40 people to watch me take responsibility for my life. And by the end of the evening, 6 relationships in that room had quietly ended. Not with shouting. Not with drama. Just with people seeing the truth for the first time. The candles flickered. I blew them out. And that was the moment the story finally closed.